My father hung out in those bars, and he began to interact with all of these artists that came from all around the world. There was a sketch artist that was a very, very good painter by the name of Frida Kahlo that he knew, and her boyfriend, Diego Rivera, that came around once in a while, and they would hang out at the bar.
That was jeweler and metal artist Danny Macchiarini. I'm Jeff, and this is Storied San Francisco. Every week on this podcast, you'll hear from artists, community leaders, writers, and San Franciscans from all walks of life, telling stories, sharing personal histories, and trying to put into words what makes this city so special. Welcome to episode 40, part 1. Danny is a second-generation San Franciscan. He's been running Macchiarini Creative Designs in North Beach since his dad handed it over. In this podcast, Danny Mac, as he's known to his friends and loved ones, takes us through the history of his Italian grandfather and his dad, Peter Macchiarini. Danny tells the story of Peter's involvement with San Francisco Bohemians back in the 1930s and their discovery of a now-beloved city character. Here's Danny.
Yeah, I am a native. I was born and raised here. I was born in August 15th, 1953. I'm going to be 66 in 3 or 4 days.
Happy early birthday.
Yeah. So I was talking about my father when he arrived back from Italy here in 1927. He was born here in 1909 on the Waller Ranch in Sonoma County. And my grandfather, unfortunately, never got assimilated to this country, even though he was a highly successful contract hop trainer. Where he came here as a migrant farm worker in 1905 from Italy, and we were the migrants during that period, not the Mexicans or the Latinos in the beginning. And so he worked as a basic immigrant worker in the fields, and so did my grandmother. Actually, when my father was born in 1909, he was born in the morning, and my grandmother was back out in the fields working in the afternoon. Really tough people. But my grandfather had been trained by Germans in Italy to be a hop trainer, and he wound up being an amazing hop trainer. And the owners found out on these various farms how fantastic hop trainer he was. He was getting yields out of these hops that were 10, 15, 20% higher than they had gotten before when he had trained the hops. So he wound up between 1905 and 1921, when he went back to Italy, amassing a pretty good fortune. Much to the chagrin of my father, who didn't want to go back and live in Italy. Unfortunately, in 1922 also, after they went back to Italy, Mussolini came to power. And he was out to make Italy great again and build the new Roman Empire, which the Tuscans, among which my grandfather and grandmother, my family, hated. The fascists. They were the first group to form partisan groups in 1925 and actually start fighting the fascists. So my father grew up between 1922 and 1927, when he became 17, grew up under fascist rule. But he fell in love with art, and he wound up in the Academy of Art in Pietrasanta. He wound up learning marble carving. He became an accomplished marble carver. But in the middle of his education, his college education, which was also in Florence as well as in Pietrasanta, he was interrupted by the black shirts. Now, the black shirts, when they were recruited for the Italian army, they would go from village to village, and they would line up all the 16 through 22-year-old young men, and they would say, you're in the fascist army, you're going to go make Italy great again. You're going to build the new Roman Empire. And if you didn't go along with them, if you didn't say, all right, I'm in, I want this, it was simple. They put you up against the wall and they shot you. So my father got word that the black shirts were a village away, a couple of villages away in Viareggio, down the road in Massacarato and Viareggio. He was up the road a bit, and he grabbed his American passport and his birth certificate, and he went around them to the American embassy, and he said, "Get me the hell out of here. I'm not going to go fight for this fool."
He was of that age, 16 to 22?
He was 17.
17.
And he was 18. He was born in 1909. He wound up in 1927 at being prime age to go fight for this idiot. Mm-hmm. So he went around to the American embassy, and he got out of Italy, arrived back in San Francisco. He got a job in the Italian cemetery carving memorials. Some of them are still down there that he worked on. And he worked in 1927 until he was laid off in 1929 with everybody in the entire country for the thing called the Great Depression. And he struggled for the next few years until the National Recovery Act was established by the Roosevelt administration. And part of the National Recovery Act was the WPA.
Is your dad Peter?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I'm looking at a sign that says Peter Macchiarini Steps.
Yeah, and that's where he lived.
Okay.
He lived on the steps above where Naked Lunch is.
Oh, got it.
Right up on Kearny Street. Yeah. He lived in there, and they lived because it was so poor. He actually formed the first artist co-op in San Francisco up on those steps in the 1930s. And it was a lithograph artist and a watercolor artist that lived there. He also lived in a place called the Monkey Block, which was on Montgomery Street, where the pyramid is. He lived both places during the 1930s.
Okay.
He struggled until they established the WPA, and he became part of this group of amazing artists who were WPA artists, and they included all of the muralists. In fact, there was a pre-WPA program that the muralists on Court Tower were part of, but they all became WPA, and they used to hang out at the Tivoli at 5:30, 6 o'clock, and go and get their and talk about their work. And it was amazing, and that went on through the 1960s and into the early 70s. And I was lucky enough to meet a lot of amazing artists myself, like Sergeant Johnson, the African American artist who hang out there. In fact, we were even dropped into the studio. My father took Maya Angelou out to have a drink at the Tivoli. He knew all these amazing artists. Benny Buffano was like his leader. He was connected with Will Rogers Jr. Actually before he died in 1935 became a friend of my father's. And that's a story in and of that itself there too. Anyway, he in 1930s. Hung out with these artists, and it became like a mecca in this area. It was like the first maybe iconoclast, nonconformist movement in the United States, and it was very poor. It was Bohemians. It wasn't beatniks. People think the Beats were the first movement in San Francisco. They weren't. It was a group of Bohemians in the 30s that started the counterculture.
Does Mario's have anything to do with that? We just had lunch there, and I've always wondered.
Excuse me?
Mario's Bohemian Cigar over here.
Well,
does that have anything to do with that movement?
That was a hangout. There was in the 30s. There were like 2 or 3 hangouts that were really, really popular. One of them was called the Iron Pot, and the other one was the Black Cat. The Black Cat eventually became one of the first gay bars in San Francisco. It had gay people in the 30s that were Bohemians, but it wasn't primarily a gay bar until the 50s when the Butterfly Man took it over. Okay. All right, and that's another story, San Francisco story, which is an amazing story. But anyway, my father hung out in those bars, and he began to interact with all of these artists that came from all around the world. There was a sketch artist that was a very, very good painter by the name of Frida Kahlo that he knew, and her boyfriend, Diego Rivera, that came around once in a while, and they would hang out at the bars.
He did some of the murals at Coit Tower.
No,
right?
he didn't.
Oh, he didn't.
That was an Armitrov mural.
Okay.
Was the leader of that, but that wasn't even an Armitrov mural. It was he was the foreman up there. But that was a collective of muralists. There were amazing muralists, and there's amazing stories in those guys too.
But your dad was friends.
Yeah, but
his buddies Frida and Diego just came around and they hung out. His friends Frida and Diego just came around and they all hung
they
out.
came around when they were in town. They weren't in town all the time. They would come around, but it was like this was like the place where the artists got together and like would have their kind of like sojourn. Right, and that's actually where the Emperor Norton idea came from.
Is it?
Yeah, they were talking. They could all see fascism coming. They could all see the war coming, right? And they said, well, we need a symbol of San Francisco. This is very important for your San Francisco story. That we need a symbol of San Francisco like they have in New York, which is Statue of Liberty. We need a character that looks toward the Pacific and welcomes the immigrants, as opposed to what was happening in Tokyo, Berlin, and Rome. And at the time, we had a fascist mayor. His name was Mayor Rossi. He used to go greet the Italian ships down in the harbor with a fascist salute. This guy was out there. He also tried to break the longshoremen's strike, which my father was almost killed in that strike in 1934. But anyway, the idea of they could all see it coming. And so they were kind of like, my father was like the younger of these characters, right? He was like the young artist. He was still in his early 30s. He was, and he was developing as an artist. So, and it kind of assigned him to go out and look for this character that they might make a statue about. So my father went to the library and he started researching the history of San Francisco, and he came across the Emperor Norton. And the Emperor Norton at this time was always depicted kind of like as this buffoon, this insane buffoon who was loved by San Franciscans in his buffoonery. But the real contribution of the Emperor Norton was the fact that he was the only white man to stand up against the Chinese exclusion laws in the state capital, that he championed the immigrant, that he actually stood for gender equality in the mid-19th century. He made comments about how women should vote and how women should have a right to speak at public meetings, blah, 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 right? And he
crazy ideas.
Yeah, crazy, insane ideas like gender equality and that kind of thing. He stood against slavery. He actually got added to his title. In 1856, he always thought there should be an emperor to resolve the issues of the politics of the United States, right? But he was loved by all social classes in San Francisco, high and low. He came here in 1849, amassed an amazing amount of money in real estate, and then lost it all in the rice market. It was very weird. It was in court, and he wound up going a little insane. But he was friends with all the Chinese all of the white immigrants. He was friends with the Colonel General, the Presidio, and the soldiers. He was loved. Had friends in the Pacific Union Club who were very, very wealthy, and he was just loved by all these people because he was so out there and generous, right? And my father was reading about this and wow, this is the guy, man. This is the guy. Should be who represents San Francisco and the spirit of this country, right?
Would you say that Norton had been more or less forgotten before your dad found him, or because
he was progressive? That was downplayed by the people, those who were in power.
Sure. Because
they didn't want to recognize what he was saying, particularly about ethnic and gender equality and all of these things. That in his insanity, he was one of the most sane human beings of that era.
But his reputation had been quashed, is what you're saying,
because
for a while.
They couldn't quash him because he was loved so much. In fact, he was loved. To show you how much he was loved, there's two stories. He actually printed his first proclamation declaring himself Emperor of the United States in 1856. And it was a slow day down at the Call, which later became the Chronicle, and they printed it. And immediately, San Franciscans fell in love with the idea of it. And he had an entourage. They followed him around. They hung out with him. It was cool. He was the cool dude, right? And he also had befriended the Colonel General of the Presidio. He would play chess and checkers with him, right? Every Tuesday or Thursday. I can't remember what it was when I was reading about it. But he was like really close to him. Mm-hmm. So he declared himself emperor. But when the American Civil War broke out in 1861, several European powers were threatening to retake Mexico. And they actually had armadas assembled and they began to sail out to take them. Like France and Spain for sure, and maybe England, but anyway, 2 or 3 of them. And so, of course, the emperor got word of this, and he went down to the Colonel General who was befriending. He ordered U.S. forces up on alert to go defend Mexico.
Protect Mexico.
And guess what? They went up on alert. And they started marching toward Mexico, and word got back to those embassies that U.S. forces were on the way to defend Mexico, and they turned around in the middle of the fucking ocean, right? Next day in a call, Emperor of the United States, protector of Mexico.
That's where that comes from.
Amazing story. And when he died in 1880, he had the only state funeral at City Hall, which was, and his coffin was passed by 10,000 San Franciscans who paid homage to him, right? It was the only state funeral until Moscone Milk was murdered in San Francisco. And I think there's only been one since then. It was Lee, the mayor that just died. Mm-hmm. So anyway, in fact, every year, but still there's a gathering at his gravesite by a bunch of eccentrics that I'm part of called the Clampers.
Oh,
but
yeah,
that's even another story.
It is.
So we'll let that go.
But sometime between when he passed away and now the 1930s, his reputation had been, you're saying by some of the rich, powerful elite of San Francisco had kind of tarnished his reputation, and your father just rediscovered him.
They basically there was a comic strip with Emperor Norton in it. They basically turned him into just a buffoon,
a quack.
It wasn't. They didn't even pay him the honor of turning him into a clown. They made him like a buffoon, and that's different, right? And it was something to laugh at, and between 1880 and the 1930s, no one talked about his anti-slavery or his pro-Chinese or his pro-woman or his anti-colonial positions. They just talked about him wanting to build a bridge between San Francisco and Oakland, which was good. That was a good thing, right? We like Oakland, right? That's all. But when my father did this research, and he said, "All right, here's the guy." And so the other artists, when they gathered at Tibbs, all right, start sculpting him out. So you turn around and you look, and there's the statue he made for the Emperor Norton in 1936. He made the first one, and he instead of giving him a sword, he gave him an umbrella, protector. A protector. He demilitarized him consciously because of the fascists, right? And he said we should build this on the waterfront. It should face the Pacific, and we should put it up there 30, 40 feet high, right? Welcome the immigrant.
That still sounds like a good idea to me.
Still do that.
We should absolutely do that.
We should still put it up. We need more today than they needed it back then, right?
So we have your father to thank for the resurrection of his reputation.
There was no statue. There was no celebration of the Emperor Norton until in the 1930s. My father, in fact, there's a newspaper article here. We'll pull it out for you. That he actually got a write-up on it in 1939. He penetrated through the establishment, and they actually did a write-up on him on the fact that we needed a statue of Emperor Norton. But at the time, we had a fascist mayor. Then we went into the war, and after the war, we went into the McCarthy era. And after that, there was the Vietnam War era, and nobody wanted to deal with this guy. And then we had the Ronald Reagan era, and of course, there would be no money for a statue of the Emperor Norton under Reagan. And then we had, blah blah blah. We went on. Finally, we tried at the very end of his life to try and resurrect the idea. We actually had a couple articles in local newspapers here on doing a statue of the Emperor Norton, but it went for naught. But when my father died, friends of mine got together and they said, wow, it's really sad that there was no statue of the Emperor Norton put up. And because they had named the stairs after him, we proposed putting a little plaza at the top of the stairs, right? Before he died, just really quickly. Before he died, I said, Dad, why? He did the Emperor Norton. I said, why didn't you do the two dogs that attached themselves to the Emperor's entourage? They weren't really the Emperor's dogs, but why didn't you, they made a good living hanging out with the Emperor. Why didn't you do Bummer and Lazarus? He said, I don't have time, you do it. So I did. I started sculpting them out, and I sculpted out Bummer and Lazarus.
Oh, there they are.
So involved in this plaza that they proposed, was that we actually set up the two dogs on either side of it, and it had a little dog place where the dogs could go and get water, that you were walking your dog, right? And it was a really cool little plaza. But of course, there was a handful of NIMBYs on that hill that didn't want it to happen. And because they were afraid they would be inundated by tourists and everyone else. So it died again, right, after he died. And this is about 2002, 2003. 2004, I got a call. And then we'll go back into the studio and I'll show you. I got a call from this guy, Johnny Rieglin. And he said, I'm working with a consortium. I came across your website. I'm working with a consortium. We're redoing the San Francisco Brewing Company restoring it into the old Comstock Saloon. Mm-hmm. And we saw your website. We saw the Emperor Norton there. Do you want to put the statue up? Mm-hmm. I said, do we want to put the statue up? We've been trying to put this statue up for 60 years, right? 70 years. And so Johnny got together. Well, it's not 40 feet high, it's 4 feet high. Okay. But my daughter and I, we blew it up with a computer, but then we had to resculpt it to get the balance right because the computer changes all that. But now there is a statue of the Emperor Norton.
At the Comstock Saloon?
At the Comstock Saloon, way up on top of the bar.
Okay.
You can see it up there, and there actually is the logo. It's Emperor of the United States, Protector of Mexico, and he's up there.
That was Danny Macchiarini. Check back Thursday, when Danny will share more about his and his family's San Francisco story. Music for the podcast is by Otis McDonald. Film photography is by Michelle Kilfeather. Find the nearly 90 episodes we've done over on our website, storiedsf.com. While you're there, please help support this project by going to our store page and checking out the various pledge levels. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to stay current on everything we do. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, please rate and review the show for us. And if you have ideas of who should be on the podcast, we're happy to hear. Our email is storiedsf@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.